Thanks so much, Don. Really appreciate you and your audience having me and giving me the ability to present without traveling to Waterloo. So my name is Liam O'Brien, and I'm a professor in civil and environmental engineering at Carleton in Ottawa. And I'm going to talk about a very broad topic today, which is telework and the sort of climate change implications, essentially. And I've been working on this for about 4 years, so just before COVID. So I kind of got lucky there. So the way I've looked at telework and the energy implications, and of course the resulting emissions implications, is to consider it in four domains. The first is transportation, the second is offices, the third is the home, and lastly, information and communication technology. And what I've been interested in is this big question about whether telework is actually good from an environmental perspective. What you're going to see is that it's not so straightforward. So telework has been sold as a environmentally friendly thing for about 50 years now, starting with a researcher in California, Jack Mills. And I wrote a literature review paper on this a couple of years ago now, right when COVID started. But the way I like to think about it is that if we start on the left from some status quo, yes, telework probably leads to energy savings from transportation, although that's not trivial. I'll go into detail in a moment. Probably leads to energy savings in the office sense. And those two combined could be considered the maximum potential savings. But then there's all these rebound effects that carve away at those benefits. There's still energy use at our vacant offices. We're probably using more energy in our homes now because of heating and electronics and so on. There might be some added transportation because, for example, we're not trip chaining as much. So now we have to make deliberate errands that are separate trips and not on the way to work. And we're probably more reliant on communications technology and the associated energy and emissions from that. So the net benefit might be quite a bit less than we anticipate. So I've spent the last 3 years, or some of the last 3 years, trying to quantify this a bit more closely. And that's what this talk is about. In the past, there's been, well, before COVID, there were 24 studies that tried to capture 2 or more of these domains. And so kind of like life cycle analysis, the question of whether telework saves energy really depends on where you draw your spatial and temporal boundaries. It's actually so important. I think you can get practically any answer you want if you draw the boundaries right. And as such, in our research, we've tried to be quite comprehensive so that we capture kind of first and second order effects. I'm not going to go into this diagram in detail other than to say that I've had a couple of grad students try to map out all of the causes and effects related to telework. And as you can see, it's quite complex. Things like purchasing decisions, day-to-day behaviors, impact on others because of traffic, and so on. And just as an illustrative example for why we need to consider different domains simultaneously, here's a result from the Wall Street Journal last year that related office occupancy to the average travel time to work. This is for about 30 different cities in the US. And so unsurprisingly, if people have to travel further to work, they're less likely to travel to work. So there's all these interconnections that make this a really interesting research problem. So I'm going to look at each domain very briefly. This is just a flavor of the topic, but I know it's probably a general or broad audience, so I'll keep it kind of basic. So in offices, I'm going to go through each domain. In offices, there's some positive energy benefit to telework, but it's not as much as people would think. For instance, our buildings are generally not designed to adapt very well according, with lighting and heating and cooling systems and ventilation. And so our offices use nearly as much energy if they're full as if they're empty, kind of surprisingly. The occupants don't have that much of a role in energy use. And here's just one example. This came right after COVID, but the results would not be too different a few years later. What they found is that weeks after lockdowns, the energy savings in office buildings across the US didn't exceed about 25%. So not all that significant compared to what we'd expect, considering the buildings are virtually empty. A little bit more theoretically, what we see in buildings is that, again, very surprisingly, buildings or office buildings are not that sensitive to occupancy. And so whether they're empty or full, the energy use is pretty similar depending on the building. And so that's something we need to improve looking ahead, because I don't think we'll ever see quite the same predictable occupancy. At home, the literature is all over the place, and they've predicted increases of 0.1 to 20 kilowatt hours per telework days. That's household energy. So multiple orders of magnitude difference. And it's so dependent, again, on behavior, decisions, purchasing decisions. Is the heating and cooling zone? So in other words, can you control different rooms separately? Or is it just the same for the whole house, which is what we have in most of Canada? I'll move quickly. One of the rebound effects is that people often look for bigger homes if they know they're going to be teleworking. And so that's going to inherently increase energy use for heating and cooling. But indirectly, if you have a certain budget for your household, it may cause you to move outward from the city to regions that are more dependent on cars. And so there's all these cascading effects that might not be obvious. One of the things we noticed when we looked at electricity before and after COVID was that energy use in homes in Ottawa went up about 12%. But the timing of electricity use changed quite a bit. And this has big implications on emissions, because what source of electricity we use depends greatly on the time of day. We have peaking plants in Ontario that are gas usually. And so there's going to be more emissions associated with electricity use in the afternoon when the energy use in our homes seems to have gone up. Maybe I'll skip ahead in the interest of time. So speaking of floor area and choosing bigger homes, one of the things I've looked at in my previous research is the fact that while our Canadian home building stock has improved quite a bit in energy use, so a 35% drop in the last 3 decades, which is quite good, really. But our home energy has gone up 27%, or sorry, our home area has gone up per person 27% during this time. And I suspect we're going to see more interest in larger homes. And so this is only going to get worse because of the prevalence of teleworking. So the net benefit of all the energy efficiency measures and incentive programs that the government has invested in has roughly halved just because of the increased floor area. On the transportation side, this is also not so clear, although this is one of the direct benefits of telework. There's all sorts of things happening. So historically, 3 out of 21 studies that looked at the transportation impacts of telework found an increase in transportation use. Some of the reasons for trip chaining, so combining trips. If you stay at home and your car stays at home, now your family has access to the car. You might choose bigger cars or more cars under the illusion that you're going to drive less, so you can justify a larger, more fuel-consuming car. Or you might not opt for an electric car because you're not commuting as much. There's likely to be more urban sprawl at the broader population scale. And less traffic means, ironically, people might choose to drive more because they're not dissuaded from driving. I'll move forward quickly. This is a classic graph that shows the relationship between population density and fuel use. And it's 30-something years old, but it still holds true, at least the relationship. And it illustrates the importance of having a reasonable population density. And my fear is that telework is going to reduce density in some cases through sprawl. And we can see that in the Greater Toronto area. Population growth has gone up quite a bit in the suburbs and exurbs. And those are the places where carbon emissions are the most intense per person. So this is quite problematic. The information and communication technology side is not so significant. I would say it's probably something like 1% of energy use. Even if this doubles, it's not so significant in absolute terms. So I'm coming to a close here, but in the past, those studies that have looked at telework and tried to answer whether teleworking has a net benefit, what we see, and these are the only studies I thought I could truly compare properly because they're fairly comprehensive. The more recent studies show less benefit. And the studies that are more comprehensive, looking at more than 2 domains, also show less benefit. So my hypothesis here is that if we do a more holistic analysis, teleworking is really not going to be the holy grail to sustainability. I did a recent study where we looked at 11 people and tried to track their energy use very closely for a year. And there's probably not time to go into details, but the highlights are where you live in a city doesn't necessarily affect your emissions and energy use. For example, someone who lived very close to their work was taking a lot of recreational drives to go bike and so on. So the situation is very complex, but the difference between individuals was much bigger than the impact of telework. And in closing, I wanted to mention, just to be a little bit on theme with this topic, and blue-green infrastructure, that as we spend more time at home, the importance of views and access to daylight and green space and blue space is really important. And we're seeing the tools in engineering and architecture to quantify some of these things. So I think there's a lot of potential in the near future. Thank you very much for your time.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. We now get to move to in-person